In our last episode, we surveyed the site of Tiwanaku and its impressive structures. Today, we're going to tell the second part of the story of Tiwanaku, the story of the Tiwanaku Empire and of greater Tiwanaku culture. Tiwanaku culture reached its zenith from 500 to 1000 CE and left a great legacy that would inspire future cultures and states to come. Without further ado, let's jump in. When we left off in part 1, we explained how Tiwanaku used their raised field agriculture systems to generate an enormous surplus of crops. This enabled it to become one of the first American empires, or at least the first truly expansive state. There's actually debate about whether Tiwanaku was truly an empire in the full sense of the term, but we'll explore all that soon enough. Tiwanaku would eventually exert a powerful influence on territories from the Altiplano to the Pacific coast, from modern-day southern Peru to northern Chile and Argentina. Empire or not, very impressive. But what made this possible, or even desirable for the leaders of Tiwanaku? The source of Tiwanaku's wealth and power was the control of the huge agricultural surpluses that were grown from the raised fields in the Lake Titicaca Basin. The goal of Tiwanaku foreign policy was the acquisition of exotic resources for the Tiwanaku elite, particularly resources that could not be obtained within the Altiplano. Two important resources that serve as good examples are maize and coca. Interestingly, there is one spot you can cultivate maize in the Titicaca Basin, and that's on the island of the Sun in the middle of the lake. Normally, these crops can't be grown in the high altitudes of the Altiplano, but thrive in the lower Andean slopes, the yungas. Maize was very important for Tiwanaku rituals because it could be used to create chicha beer. Remember those caros we saw in the last episode? Those were for drinking chicha, similar to how we use champagne flutes for drinking champagne. Now, looking at coca, its modern claim to fame is that it's the source of cocaine. But back in the day, coca leaves were highly valued by all Andean people. They could be chewed as a stimulant, which was a welcome pick-me-up for the weary commoner, and especially the elite. In Inca times, coca leaves also had a ritual and religious role as well, and this may have been the case at Tiwanaku. Several sculptures of Tiwanaku nobility show them chewing coca leaves. In this instance, these crops were vital to elite identity and religious ritual, and the expanding state needed a way to ensure that these would be available. To this end, it became imperative to control areas that produced these and other desired resources found in coastal, desert, or tropical regions. And so, the elites at Tiwanaku set their sights on the frontier. But what did this expansion look like? Before the 5th century CE, Tiwanaku was just one of several local powers. By 400 CE, Tiwanaku's expansion began in earnest. No longer content to be a local power, it became much more expansive. By the 6th century, the Lake Titicaca Basin was firmly in control of the city, and their expansion had begun to spill out into the surrounding hinterlands. Now, Tiwanaku expansion and imperialism was much more incorporative than transformative. All of this territory on the map was not the result of military victories or grand strategy from what we can tell. While Tiwanaku certainly had the ability to leverage military force when necessary, their expansion appears to have been more so the result of well-forged political relationships, colonization, and economic agreements. 3 areas provide us good examples of Tiwanaku expansion and can show us different aspects of that expansion. The first and most dramatic example of a new Tiwanaku order is in the Mokegwa Valley, southeast of the Titicaca Basin. The valley is dotted by several sites that are clearly Tiwanaku. These settlements were likely founded by Tiwanaku colonists who created a bridgehead from which they could work with the locals and influence them. We know from archaeological remains that some of these settlers were an elite class who could have easily worked with the local elites. By about 600 CE, this appears to have paid off because there's a radical shift in the local ceramics and they begin to incorporate many Tiwanaku features. We even see impressive administration centers built in these outposts, all replete with Tiwanaku's signature architecture, terraced mounds, and stone temples. Even genetic evidence shows that Tiwanaku settlers and locals were closely linked. Tiwanaku's presence also coincides with the development of large hydraulic projects in the valley, particularly the building of new irrigation canals. In this respect, Tiwanaku's leaders may have played an important role in mustering and organizing the labor for these projects. As a result of this investment in the local infrastructure, the population expanded. As raw materials and crops flowed out of the valley, fine Tiwanaku products such as ceramics and textiles flowed in. Now, as impressive as the Tiwanaku presence is in the Mokegwa Valley, it's something of a unique case. If this was the only region I highlighted, I'd be rightfully accused of cherry picking. Tiwanaku's presence can easily be found elsewhere, but not quite to the same degree. Let's take a look at two other areas, starting with the Cochabamba Valley to the east. Similar to the Mokegwa Valley, this was a very fertile region, well suited to agriculture, and it was settled early in Tiwanaku's expansion by Tiwanaku colonists. Looking at the archaeology there, the degree of Tiwanaku influence is much less pronounced. On one hand, local pottery does begin to incorporate Tiwanaku style, and we see similar administrative centers to those in the Mokegwa Valley after the Tiwanaku Entrada. On the other hand, fine imported Tiwanaku textiles and ceramics are much rare, and almost all are found in elite burials. Now, to be fair, there hasn't been as much archaeology conducted in this region, so this assessment could change down the road, but at the moment, Tiwanaku presence in the Cochabamba region looks much less concrete. Finally, let's move back to the coast, specifically to the Izapa Valley in modern-day Chile. In this area, Tiwanaku presence is even less evident. While there are locally produced ceramics with Tiwanaku influence, they're rare and they never displace the local kabuza style. Although there are some imported fineries, these might just be the natural result of trade rather than dominion. Also, there are only a few small cemeteries that are made up of distinctly Tiwanaku graves in the Izapa Valley. Was the Izapa Valley colonized or more indirectly influenced? The debate goes on, and I'm not really going to take a side on it because the important takeaway here is that Tiwanaku control and influence was not characterized by a single unified policy, but by a patchwork of different approaches depending on what was possible at any given moment at any given place. In fact, there's interesting evidence that even close to home, Tiwanaku control was not as tight as previously thought. In the Desaguadero Valley, just to the immediate south of Tiwanaku, a closer look at Tiwanaku's presence shows an evolving and changing policy. This area was a caravan route that linked Tiwanaku to the Cochabamba Valley, and controlling it would have been a high priority. To this end, Tiwanaku tried to found new caravan settlements, but these could never displace the cities and trade centers that were already established there. Afterwards, Tiwanaku focused on developing political relationships with those same cities, and it's not until after 700 CE that we finally begin to see Tiwanaku artifacts appear at these older trade centers. So what does all this tell us? It shows us that Tiwanaku control was not applied in a regular fashion. Strong imperial states typically promote a common political, economic, and religious plan to the areas that they conquer and subsequently control. Let's take the Roman Empire for comparison. Where Rome went, it applied a systematic political and economic policy across all its provinces so that they all had a common organization and administration. That doesn't seem to be happening here, and it paints an interesting picture of the greater Tiwanaku state. Clearly, the state was capable of bringing a tremendous degree of influence and control into an area, like we saw in the Mokegwa Valley. Other areas outside the Lake Titicaca Basin don't really show this level of control. The state could not apply a systematic approach to expansion, but made inroads into foreign lands by a variety of means with a variety of results. It was likely not an empire as we understand that term today, but still a cultural powerhouse. That efflorescence and spread of culture resulted in the proliferation of Tiwanaku art all over the southern Andes. Now let's turn our attention there. I'm not going to go into excruciating detail because I'm no art historian, but it's definitely worth seeing nonetheless. We've already seen the most famous examples of this when we saw the incredible monolithic sculptures from the city of Tiwanaku back in part 1. These are the successors to the earlier Yayamama pieces that characterized early sculpture at Tiwanaku. As we mentioned in part 1, this style changed to a more three-dimensional form of sculpture thanks to developments at Pucara. Not only did sculpture change, but the subject matter did as well. As time went on, specific people began to get memorialized in sculpture. These sculptures, like the Ponce and Bennett monoliths, represent the apogee of Tiwanaku sculpture. It's not easy to see in these pictures, but they're full of incredible detail. You can see patterned pants, belts, tunics, and headbands carved into the work. Thankfully, I can show you this smaller ancestor statue to give you an idea of the incredible detail that's packed in here. Tiwanaku stonework was applied to architecture as well. We've already seen marvelous examples of stone masonry in Part 1, but perhaps the most iconic stonework is the Sun Gate. Now, if you really want to get a good idea of how the Sun Gate would have looked in antiquity, you need to imagine the relief work inlaid with gold. This isn't unique to the Sun Gate. Other carved lintels at the site show evidence of being inlaid with gold and other precious metals. If you look very closely at these, you can see very tiny holes that would have held pins to secure the gold inlay. These golden entrances would have been absolutely breathtaking to see in their full glory. And speaking of gold, the artisans of Tiwanaku were no strangers to metalworking. Gold artifacts, while not very abundant due to centuries of looting, do appear in the archaeological record. Gold was important, not just for ornament, but also for offerings. In fact, gold and silver offerings dating back to Tiwanaku have been discovered on the islands of the Sun and the Moon in Lake Titicaca. These works are stunning to behold. But perhaps the most common art medium that survives is pottery. Now, you could go into enormous detail on Tiwanaku's ceramic styles and how they all fit into the grand chronology of Tiwanaku and Andean art, but that's going a little too far into the weeds. Nonetheless, I always like showing ceramics because of how distinct pottery can be to a culture. We've already seen a good range of Tiwanaku ceramics at one point or another during this episode, and in Part 1 as well. Tiwanaku-style pots, bowls, plates, incense burners, and chichaqueros are abundant in South America. Particularly distinct are the queros that we mentioned earlier. Early Tiwanaku style is characterized by incision, modeling, and slip painting. Mature Tiwanaku style, which is typically what you'll see in museums and books, is characterized by the red, orange, gray, black, and white paint used to color these vessels. Animal and geometric motifs are very common, as they are in a lot of Andean ceramics. Portrait ceramics are also known, and some of them, like this one, can be incredibly lifelike. They aren't as common here as they are on the northern Peruvian coast, but they're among my personal favorites. These are masterpieces of craftsmanship. The rarest works of Tiwanaku culture are their textiles made from camelid wool. Textiles were an important art form in Andean culture and served as important indicators of identity and status. High-quality textiles could also be very important political gifts to outside communities. Unfortunately for us, these textiles preserve very poorly in the harsh environment of the Altiplano, and it's rare for them to survive centuries of weather and abuse. Thankfully, as we've seen, Tiwanaku goods found their way to drier environments on the Pacific coast. Textiles that were laid to rest with their owners in the desert do sometimes survive, and what we have is amazing. Now, I have to apologize because many of the best examples of Tiwanaku textiles are in private collections, and while you can find very good pictures of these in books and online exhibits, finding high-resolution images of them online can be impossible, so I can't show you everything I'd like. Again, my apologies. These tunics, hats, and sashes show an incredible variety in design. Larger works were even used as decoration by being draped over public buildings. There's a lot of variety that you can find here, like animals, people, deities, and even geometric patterns full of vivid and bright colors. Even our friend the staff deity makes an appearance. Hello, old chap. And speaking of the staff god, let's take a good look at Tiwanaku religion. Religion was an important facet of Tiwanaku culture. As Tiwanaku grew, it became an important cult center, as we've seen from the architecture at the site. Unfortunately, the details of this cult and local religion remain a mystery, but drawing on archaeology and later civilizations that we have much better accounts of, we can speculate on some of the features of Tiwanaku religion. An important aspect of Tiwanaku cosmology was their view of nature. To the local Aymara people of Tiwanaku today, the lake, the mountains, and the streams aren't objects, but animate beings that can be personified and communicated with. If this was also the case in antiquity, it explains the recreation of natural landmarks and processes within the urban area. Recall that the Akapana and Pumapunku are symbolic recreations of the surrounding mountains, and that the moat that once surrounded the Tiwanaku ceremonial core recreated a lake island. These would have helped replicate a harmonious cosmological landscape from a shared mythology. Another practice that archaeology may be able to corroborate is ancestor worship and veneration. In later Inca practice, royal dead were wrapped up in precious textiles and publicly adored and even consulted. There's a lot of speculation by archaeologists that this may have also been practiced at Tiwanaku, although we can't know for sure. Another more macabre practice was human sacrifice. Excavations in the Akapana foundations show the remains of sacrificial victims, most likely the result of a ritual performed at the site. These offerings to the gods may have been a way of showing dominion over newly subjugated or incorporated peoples. Reconstructing the Tiwanaku pantheon is no easy task, but fortunately Tiwanaku does give us a view of one of, if not the principal deity of the culture. Now this may or may not be the same god that we've seen elsewhere in northern Peru, despite the familiar depiction. I've seen experts assert that he's a forerunner to the Aymara weather god, Thanupa, who's characterized by the lightning bolts he's holding. Others assume that he's an earlier version of Viracocha, the Inca creator deity, which makes some sense since later Inca legends credit Viracocha with creating humans at Lake Titicaca. Regardless of who the gods were, they had a special place in the life of all the Tiwanaku people. The state religion played a crucial role in legitimizing the power of Tiwanaku's rulers and elites. Evidence of elaborate feasts can be seen in the elite residences of the Patuni district in the city center. Priests or even rulers would have acted as intermediaries to the divine. Snuffing paraphernalia for various hallucinogens and narcotics from this period abound, and these would have been used by priests to communicate directly with the gods. And this paraphernalia isn't just limited to the Tiwanaku heartland, but can be found even at the fringes of the Tiwanaku sphere of influence. Where Tiwanaku went, so did its rituals and cult. The success of all this expansion actually forced an interesting encounter. You see, at the same time that Tiwanaku was settling down in the Mokegwa Valley and consolidating their control there, a new competitor showed up, the Warri. Now, the Warri Empire isn't our topic for today, and they'll get their own episode someday, so I'm going to keep my summary of them very brief. The Warri were a state based in the central Peruvian highlands to the north, and had their ambitions set to the south. Unlike Tiwanaku, the Warri were warriors, and their expansion had a much more military flavor to it. So what happens when two burgeoning states butt heads? Let's check it out. In the Mokegwa Valley, at the site of Cerro Baul, which is in the upper reaches of the valley, the Warri set up an outpost and settlement. They terraced the mountainsides and diverted water for irrigation from the same river that the Tiwanaku inhabitants were using. The Tiwanaku settlers were farming in the lower areas of the valley, and with the Warri moving in, they now had less water with which to irrigate their crops. Did this lead to conflict? It actually doesn't appear so, or at least there's nothing in the archaeological record to suggest this. Although I'm sure tensions got hot, relations appear to have been remarkably cool overall, and both states seem to have tolerated each other. In fact, there's even some archaeological evidence that the Warri-Tiwanaku interaction grew as time went on, and that relations may have been getting better. However, this conflict over water proved to be a dire foreshadowing of things to come. The decline of Tiwanaku was not sudden, but slow and sequential. Remember what I said earlier about the source of Tiwanaku's wealth, that it was based off of the huge agricultural surplus from the raised field systems. When Tiwanaku began to ascend, Lake Titicaca had swollen due to increased precipitation, and as a result, the local water table had risen. As the great agricultural infrastructure took shape, it was built according to this elevated water table. Even with this in mind, it would take a serious drop in the water table to threaten the agricultural production. Unfortunately, that's exactly what appears to have happened. We have very good climactic data from this time thanks to sediment cores from the lake and glacial cores from the nearby mountains. The data paints a harrowing picture. Around 950 CE, the rainfall began a steady long-term decline that would last for centuries. At first, citizens of Tiwanaku would have barely noticed the change, but people in the lowest agricultural zones of the Mokegwa Valley near the coast would have noticed their water sources beginning to dry up. About 50 years later, settlements in the Yungas would have been struggling to keep the irrigation going in their raised fields, amidst the drought and the Warri's own use of their water. Much of the valley water ultimately comes from precipitation in the form of rainwater, mountain runoff, and shallow groundwater springs. Now, as the outlying communities in the hinterland began to fail, the Lake Titicaca Basin was still chugging. Maybe not producing as much surplus as before, but no one was starving. Yet. As the 11th century wore on, the drought continued and even intensified, never relenting. It would continue on for centuries more. As the water table and lake level dropped lower and lower, nothing could be done to keep the irrigation canals flowing with water. More and more people must have abandoned the fields to take up fishing and pastoralism, which would have destabilized the society. By 1100 CE, the great city of Tiwanaku was finally abandoned, but perhaps not without some ceremony. Excavations on the Akapana recovered a sealed room with a major offering, including, among other things, several disarticulated llamas, plaques, hammered silver sheets, and several elaborate broken ceramics that date to this time. Given that dating and the fact that the room was rendered inaccessible, this could very well be the remains of a termination ritual, the final farewell of a now reduced and disgraced priestly elite. In the aftermath of this catastrophe, Lake Titicaca would be ravaged by depopulation as people relocated to more fertile areas. The psychological impact of this over generations must have been devastating. For centuries, the people of Tiwanaku had lived in a blissful harmony with the harsh altiplano landscape, only to have the environment cruelly turn on them. The collapse was so total that urban civilization vanished from Lake Titicaca for almost 400 years, replaced by political instability and competing petty states. It wasn't until the 1400s that the basin would again be reunited politically, long after the achievements of Tiwanaku had been forgotten. Tiwanaku left a looming legacy in the southern Andes. As the memory of Tiwanaku's history, its leaders, and its accomplishments faded into obscurity, the site itself and its art and architecture were revered by the indigenous people. To the visitor, the stoneworks of Tiwanaku littering the ground must have looked like the bleached bones of a great beast of old. The Inca saw Lake Titicaca as the place of human creation, and Tiwanaku as a holy place, the origin of humanity. In one recorded legend that we've alluded to previously, Viracocha himself journeyed to Tiwanaku, and there sculpted and designed the people of the earth. So important was this site to later Inca mythology that the Inca at one point supposedly considered making Tiwanaku the seat of their empire. Not a bad legacy indeed. When the Spanish arrived at the site, they were equally amazed at what they saw. The same account from the Spanish conquistador Pedro de Cieza de Leon that we heard in Part 1 went on to say,
Tiwanaku is famous for its great buildings, which without question are a remarkable thing to behold. Near the main dwellings is a man-made hill built on great stone foundations. Beyond this hill are two stone idols of human size and shape, with the features beautifully carved, so much so that they seem the work of great artists or masters. Some of these stones are very worn and wasted, and there are others so large that one wonders how human hands could have brought them to where they now stand. When one considers the work, I cannot understand or fathom what kind of instruments or tools were used to work them, for it is evident that before these huge stones were dressed and brought to perfection, they must have been much larger to have been left as we see them.
If you ever get a chance to travel to Tiwanaku, I'd expect that you'd be left with the same impression. The far-reaching impact of Tiwanaku's civilization and culture left an indelible mark on the Andean landscape. Under Tiwanaku's auspices, the Lake Titicaca Basin was transformed into a giant breadbasket and a vibrant cultural hub. Today, Tiwanaku is aptly recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for its incredible achievements. It's a shame that Tiwanaku isn't better known, because it is truly one of the greatest civilizations of the Americas. It's my hope that this video has given you an appreciation for it. And with that, we'll wrap up the episode. Special thanks to my patrons listed below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you would like to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon. The link is in the description below. You can also follow us on Facebook. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.